Welcome to OpenTechTalks.tv. Today we have a guest speaker, Terry Ziemniak. He is the CISO, Chief Information Security Officer. And today our topic primarily focusing on the security on different projects and as an organizations. And as we are into AI era, so this is the right time that we will get some knowledge from Terry. Terry, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you, Kashif. It's a pleasure being here.
Thank you so much for joining us. So, for audience, if they want to know about you, who are Terry, how did he started, what he's doing, maybe just give us some background and intro to.
Absolutely. So, real quick, my career paths had about three primary phases. First, it was very technical, so I got out of college many years ago. Very technical, hands-on, bits and bytes kind of guy doing security testing, penetration testing, security architecture, building big solutions and whatnot. So that was good. It was fun. But then I transitioned the middle of my career over to compliance and executive leadership. So back in the early 2000s, there really was not a lot of, not a big grouping of chief information security officer, security executives available. So, it's kind of in that first phase of corporate CISOs. So I joined that group, and that gave me kind of a different focus because early on it was a very technical view of cybersecurity. Now I'm more on the business side. So, it's transitioning from, what can we do to what should we do? How much money should we spend? It's a lot of risk conversations. So that was the middle of my career. And then lastly, or currently, maybe not lastly, but currently I'm working as a fractional CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, which means I work part-time for a handful of small companies, small and mid-sized companies. And really what I do is I provide the security executive presence, and we talk about roadmap and strategy and risk and third party and contracts. So I kind of help them through that space.
All right. So, how long you been doing this fractional role?
It's been 8 years.
8 years.
8 years.
Okay.
It's
So it's
you know, I,
more, no more fractional.
yeah, I think I
All right.
was I was fractional before fractional was cool. So, back when I started, people may have heard of fractional
Hmm.
CFOs.
Right.
The financial guys are the ones that start all this. But nowadays, with COVID and the gig economy and everyone shifting, there's a lot of people putting their hat in the fractional space. I think the difference, Kashif, is a lot of people may play in that space, but fractional, I think, is only part of it. The other part is fractional executive. If you're really a fractional executive, you have to have executive experience. And I think that's the differentiator from part-time consultants versus fractional executives. And I consider myself in that second group.
Okay. And if someone is new from the audience and he doesn't, or he or she doesn't know anything about fractional, so how this is a new term which is being used as you mentioned after the COVID and that one. So how you will explain them that.
Yeah, I think the best way to explain it is maybe contrast it with a full-time executive. So traditional executive, if you want a security executive or a technology officer or financial officer or marketing officer, any of those, a salary for a seasoned experience, seasoned person is going to be 200, 300 plus $1,000 a year. Really expensive, and a small and mid-sized company may not want to spend the money and frankly may not need a full-time in that position. So if I have a smaller company, I couldn't work 40 hours a week if I wanted to. There's just not that much work to be done. So the fractional model is, you'll pay me and we'll have an ongoing relationship. Again, maybe a day a week once you get rolling is typically where we work. And I'm there as the executive. Again, I talk strategy, I talk roadmap. Typically, the fractional executives will then call upon the right resources. So again, security space or technology space, the executive isn't typically the one that's hands-on keyboard building stuff or putting in firewall rules or whatever the rules may be. So your executive will bring in the right resources to do the work, which is kind of how the economics work. You don't have to pay me part-time to do everything. I just do
Mhm.
part of it, and then I find the right people in-house or perhaps outsourced, find the right people to do the work. And that's how a part-time executive is supposed to work.
Right. All right. So if we move the conversation from being the fractional part of, and you must be working over the last 8 years with small to large enterprises, and this question is keeping in the context of the challenges on the cybersecurity and which we are facing as a whole world. So what are the common patterns which are you are observing as being emerged on the cybersecurity from organizations investment on this area or versus the risks which we have?
Well, it's interesting. So I just gave a presentation last week to my local county IT steering committee on cybersecurity. And they asked that I come and talk about cybersecurity, and there's a lot you can talk about in the cybersecurity space. I took a few minutes to think about what do these IT leaders really need to know. And what I did is I went through and I looked at the cyber insurance trends. So if you really want to know what's impacting companies, you could read the scary articles, but honestly, the real impactful stuff drives insurance claims. And those insurance reports really tell you what's happening, how often, and how bad are those issues. So if you really want to see what's going out there, that's a fantastic place to start. There's a lot of insurance companies that have reports on their trends. And none of it was frankly surprising. It was what you would expect. It was ransomware, it was account takeover and phishing sorts of stuff. So there's nothing surprising. But frankly, I like to use those sorts of meaningful focus areas on your risk conversations. Now, there's a variety of big companies versus small. There's different ways to approach it. So big company is expected you deal with the risk more aggressively and you manage that risk more aggressively, meaning put more resources behind the risk than a small company. But what I'm finding with the small companies, interesting enough, I've actually had a big driver in business with small companies lately because the small companies sell to the big companies. And the
Right.
big companies now are saying, hey, before I buy from you, show me you're secure. It's
Mhm.
called third party risk. So the big guys don't
Right.
want to introduce risk to the small guys. And that's been a big driver of cybersecurity initiatives on the small players because, again, the big guys don't want to introduce risk. So they're putting the brakes on the small guys.
Okay. And from a risks point of view, that as there are so many risks, so are the organizations are taking seriously these practices to infuse into organizations, not just for that, okay, the large organizations are putting it, but what about the small organizations? Apart from that, okay, you want to sell to the large organization as which you mentioned it, but what are the general trends which you have seen it?
Well, it was interesting. You started with the question of are they taking it seriously? The problem is cyber is a business risk. And if you don't consider cyber a business risk, you're starting off on the wrong foot. Risk is something that you have to be aware of, you've got to manage. You don't intend to drive it down to zero. You can't drive risk down to zero effectively. But you'd manage it like other business risks. Businesses have to deal with competition. They got financial risk, they got regulatory risk, and they have cyber risk. So it's just one way to look at it. So what I do again in that kind of fractional executive role is have the conversations. Hey, this is a risk out here. We're going to manage it, but discuss it from a business point of view. So again, as a small company, if you're dealing with cyber risk in your cyber program, you're thinking about concepts of, what's the right level of security for me? And the right level of security for a small company, for a really small, I deal with a couple startups as well, or historically have. For a startup, secure enough means secure enough to sell. Small companies, if you have one person and you don't really have an income, you really can't spend money on cyber. Right? You just got to you got to know it's there and deal with it. As you get a little bigger, you got to address what your prospects and your clients want in the cybersecurity side. As you get a little bigger, you got to start looking at your business. So if you're a small business owner, you have concerns about the bad guys maybe attacking your products and your website, but the more likely attacks, the more common attacks are the business side. Is your email secure? Do you have ways to manage account fraud, those bad emails and such? So it's really a scale, but it's a consideration of, we can spend every single dollar we have as a company in cybersecurity. A, we're still not bulletproof. B, we're going to go bankrupt. So have the
Right.
conversation and think through what's the right level of security. And those that put some effort into those really early conversations are in much better place because again, they know where they need to go. They can
Mhm.
get there and then maybe they reevaluate next year. But otherwise, if you're just running blind and going after new pieces of technology, new frameworks, it's scattered and you really don't get the value out of the effort.
All right. Now, as you're working with a number of startups and organizations, and from last 1.5 year, 2 years, we are somehow landed into an AI era, and with the large language models and generative AI, and what we are seeing, every investment is moving to the AI from an organization's point of view. So, what are your experiences, early experiences working with the customers on the challenges which we are seeing with the adoption of AI into organizations?
Yeah, just like the rest of security conversations, uh, these are going to be dependent on the size and the maturity of the company. So I'm working with small players, and those smaller players, the introduction of AI frankly doesn't change much of what they have to do.
Okay.
But if they're doing their stuff poorly, they're in
Mhm.
more of a risk. So, for
Mhm.
example, a small company, you have to watch where your data's at. Is it on Terry's laptop? Is it on Kashif's laptop? If the data's someplace you don't expect, and then Terry starts using generative AI, that could take your data out. If
Right.
you don't have patches on laptops, that could be exploited and you have more Gen AI problems. Your data loss prevention, your user account access. If you don't do the basic things well, Gen AI is just going to make it worse.
Right.
So, frankly, there's not a lot of unique and novel things for small companies, but go back to your basic hygiene, do the basics, and do the basics well, and that will get you a good bit of a way to address the generative AI risk. Now, as bigger companies, I just started and actually wrapping up a really neat project
Mhm.
for a large financial organization. And what we're doing is we're building a generative AI risk and governance framework. So it's a
Okay.
big, big organization. And they're saying, well, we have the historical AI under control, the uh, modeling and machine learning stuff, but now we're in generative and it's a whole new world. How are we going to manage this correctly? So, a couple of points there is A, there are nuances in the controls. So, for
Right.
example, maybe in the old days you had antivirus protection, and you protect your data. That's great, but you use data differently in generative AI in the big companies. You got training data. Do we have proper integrity control and training data? Do we have the malware protection in your training data? So the basic protection of anti-malware, antivirus changes a little bit and has to be adjusted to the new generative AI model. So it gets really the idea that if you're in a more mature organization, you've got to review your controls and make sure the controls account for the generative AI risks. Another point I'd throw out is if you're new to the generative AI risk and governance space, NIST has an excellent document.
Mhm.
NIST, the US organization
Yeah.
here, they have a framework on generative AI risk management, and it's a fantastic document to get you started. So, again, the small companies using Copilot or GitHub, probably not relevant, but if you're building your own stuff or you have, I think they're starting to call it a these interconnected systems that one Gen AI talks to another Gen AI, you got to think through it a lot more. NIST framework is excellent because it'll walk you through things like, are you engaging the right people in the conversations? How do you
Mhm.
embed ethics?
Mhm.
Human in the middle. What does it mean to be biased? All those sorts of
Mhm.
things are built in. So it's an excellent framework. And I would tell you, if I'm putting on my forecaster binoculars and looking into the future, in the same way that NIST's cybersecurity framework has been kind of the de facto framework that if you have a breach, but you show that you followed NIST's security framework, it will mitigate your risk a bit because you're saying, hey, you're
Mhm.
being due diligence. In the same way, the NIST Gen AI risk framework is going to become the due diligence in the future. So
Okay.
start looking at it, use that because that's really going to be the benchmark going forward to did you take this seriously? Did you properly plan?
All right. All right. 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 Now, maybe as you're working with a lot of it's SMBs type of businesses, So, any tips or some thoughts for them to, and being your expert on that, and then they can take away from our today's conversation that okay, they can't afford some full time or maybe part time. Any recipe or something which you can leave them today, they can follow, and which will help them to mitigate a lot of risks.
Yeah, I'd tell you a couple things. One is I see a lot of small, mid-sized companies, they don't have their inventory under control. So the basic question of what is your stuff? And your stuff can be
Okay.
people. Do you really know who all your people are, including vendors and guests and students and
Right.
terminated employees? Who are your people? What's your data and where is your data? Is your data up at Google? Is it on, Terry's phone? Where is your data at? Where does it come from? Those sorts of things. Your devices. So vendors is also a big one. Make sure you know what your contracts are. So number one is get your inventory of under control, know your stuff.
Mm-hmm.
The second tip I'd give you is don't worry about the fringe attacks. So there's the real zero-day attacks from North Korean hackers or Chinese hackers, any scary hacker group you want.
Mm-hmm.
Those are bad, and you got to be aware of them. But 99% of the attacks are known and they are blockable. So
Hmm.
do your basic, what they call hygiene. Your
Okay.
patches have to be in place and you got to be pretty close to perfect. Your encryption has to work. Your backups have to work and your backups have to be perfect. So again, don't worry about the
Mm-hmm.
real edge cases. Do the basics, but do them really well and do them consistently because that'll address the vast majority of the problems that are out there. But
Mm-hmm.
it's never that easy. It's never that easy. It's complicated. Even something as simple as encryption, phones versus laptops versus email and transport, the backups, even saying something as simple as do we encrypt, it's hard to answer it and it's hard to do it consistently, which is why you need, managers or executives and auditing and frameworks. That's all the pieces fit together.
Yeah, I agree to that. Stock is easy, but even for these encryptions and are putting in place is challenging for them.
Agreed.
All right. So maybe before we conclude our session discussion for today, a couple of questions on back to generative AI. And as you mentioned, the NIST framework and as organizations are also new to the adoption or taking Gen AI or maybe AI into the organization's wider ecosystem. So, any suggestions for them that, okay, they're going to take either you go ahead and take this NIST framework, but is it quite complex to implement or to take it forward while you are just trying to pilot some projects? And then where your strategy is that okay, let me try out something Gen AI or AI, and then I will see afterwards that okay, what I need to do with these frameworks. So maybe during
Yeah.
this time frame, any.
Well, I think it always comes down to risk.
Mhm.
What's your risk? You're never shooting for perfection, but I'll tell you experience with one of my clients. They piloted the Microsoft Copilot tool, and they're using to generate emails or whatever they're going to do. I mentioned before, if you have security issues and you turn on Gen AI, your issues can be exploited. They had Copilot, and it was crawling all this confidential information
Right.
they didn't know was accessible to their internal folks. So yeah, things can get out of control really quickly. Back to the basics of inventory, where's your data, who has access, back to the idea of basic hygiene. But I wouldn't let perfection get in the way of getting started.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of potential out there, but take the time, put the brakes on a little bit, and have the conversation of what are we doing and why are we doing it. And I would clearly define one of the big things I see is clearly defining use cases. Why are you going to use Copilot? If you're going to use it for an internal email, great, go ahead and do it. Are you going to use it to send out email to customers? You may want to stop and think about that. Are you using your GitHub is another popular one. How are you going to manage that? What exactly is the use case? Do you have all the other protections in place? So take time clearly to find the use cases and make sure the culture is set up that if you change the use case, what we call use case drift, if you were doing this and now you're doing that because hey, it's great, let's do something else. understand the use case so you can take time to kind of think about what you're doing. But again, I think any problems you have are going to get worse with generative AI unless you're really careful about it. It's incredibly powerful, but it can go south very quickly.
Right. I think even right now we are just talking about only the taking your data and all that, but even the wider focus goes on how the models are trained, how you are gonna fine tune it, and then how you're gonna use it. I mean, there's a whole full spectrum is still left behind us, that what to do with that. And we're starting more of taking of use case, and then let's take it, because there's a pressure now from a competition, from a peer pressure, market pressure, that I need to do something on AI. And while the practices, if those security and those cyber frameworks are not mandated in the organizations, then you're taking easy less lightly to intake it. This is what my thoughts or maybe intake on it. What do you think?
Yeah, I would agree, but again, goes back to risk based. So if you're using a commercial off the shelf tool like Gemini or Copilot or GitHub, that's pretty well understood. You're really not adjusting the models, you're just kind of using a tool that's available. You can pretty easily figure out the risks, the use cases, and you can safely pilot. If you're building your own stuff, then yeah, that's a whole different world. And then you really have to use that framework. Go look at the NIST framework, read it and understand it, because you're right. It's it's new to everybody. It's like cloud technology 15 years ago. People were going on the cloud, but the engineers weren't ready for it, and they had all
Right.
sorts of security issues. They didn't turn things on correctly. Very comparable. People are building Gen AI stuff, and if you don't really know what you're doing, you get yourself in a lot of trouble. These frameworks will help set those guidelines for you and help you ask the right questions.
Right. Right. So maybe last concluding question. Any experience on where we talk about, you can share, before implementing these cybersecurity controls in organization, what was the situation with some X customer as partner as organization X, and then if you implement, what could be the changes or maybe better mean for an organization. So I'm just trying to find out why someone go before and after.
Well, is interesting. I'll tell you, my clients over the past 7+ years come to me because they've just had an issue. We have a cyber incident. We're in trouble. What are we going to do? They've heard of an incident. So I read an article. I got a friend who had a problem, or they cannot sell their product. They have some kind of external. I need to be HIPAA compliant. I
Hmm.
need to meet the obligations of a contract. This cyber insurance expectations. So those
Right.
external requirements, those really are the three big drivers. Other
Mhm.
than we just want to get better because we feel like it's the right thing to do. But cyber has always had a problem as a risk. It's hard to articulate the value unless you're really being thoughtful. What's the value of spending an extra $10,000 on Microsoft licensing to make email a little more secure? We avoid email attacks, but how do you measure that? It is complicated, which is why, again, I think it's been valuable that big companies are forcing small companies to be more secure. Then you have clear value. We must do this. Again, cyber insurance. I've got clients that are more expensive or less expensive based on how mature their insurance their cyber program is. And that sorts of thing adds up. So your security practitioner, your security leader should be able to articulate that value prop. That's an important concept, because otherwise it's just a spend. It's just money going out the door.
Right, right. Thank you so much, Terry, for joining. Any concluding remarks, and someone want to reach out to you, what is the best medium for them?
Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure chatting with you. Yeah, if anyone's interested in talking to me, feel free to reach out. My company website is TechCXO, so it's TECHCXO, and I'm on the cybersecurity page. There's only a couple of us, so you'll find me there.
All right. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you.